Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Maryland Department of Planning Sustainable Growth webinar series. My name is Brooks Phelps, and I'm a regional planner and transportation planner here at MDP. This webinar is intended to show how areas around mass transit sites can be prepared and improved for development with the intention of increasing the density and livability while highlighting some efforts in technology, policy, and design that are being made in Maryland. Today, I, along with our three panelists, Megan Fairfield-Peak, also from MDP, Darren Cooper from the Maryland Department of Transportation, and Cecily Bedwell from Design Collective will be presenting. A few things before we get started here. For those of you who are professional planners who indicated that you were interested in earning AICP credits for attending this webinar, please be on the lookout for the completion certificate from this email address. That's the certs@gutenbergcerts.com. Okay. As per Maryland state policy, third-party AI assistants are prohibited and have been blocked from this webinar. We also ask that you please ask any questions through the Q&A function, which you should see on your taskbar below the screen. If not, it may be in the More, in the three dots there section. We will reserve time for questions at the end of the webinar, but panelists will try to answer some in the Q&A panel as well. Please use this function and not the chat function for any questions. We will do our best to answer as many as we can. Attendees can also enable closed captioning via the toolbar. And lastly, this session will be recorded, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please leave before the recording begins. The webinar will be posted to MDP's website within the next few weeks after we process it for accessibility. Okay, so following today's webinar, we hope that you will be able to recognize the physical components of a walkable transit-centered community, identify the institutional elements that support added density and livability, and compare existing station area sites that might support development. I'd like to provide some background on why MDP is conducting this webinar series and specifically the Setting the Stage for TOD webinar. In 2024, we began the process of updating the state of Maryland's 12 planning visions from 2009 to a modernized and consolidated set of 8 planning principles. They now include modern planning topics such as resilience and placemaking and a shift toward mitigation and restoration versus conservation. It also means a focus on the principles that reinforce each other, such as transportation guiding land use and placemaking and vice versa. These became law on April 8th, 2025. And the updated transportation principle, prioritize transportation networks that create energy efficient, affordable, and reliable access to jobs, housing, and services, is one that reflects high-level priorities and places an emphasis on bicycle, pedestrian, and transit planning, as well as building on existing infrastructure, including transit-oriented development. So MDP began developing guidance for local jurisdictions to implement these principles and establish performance measures to track their success. These performance measures were established with the goal of improving human well-being, mitigating climate change, and growing economic opportunity. For transportation, these measures include tracking total transit ridership, reducing total vehicle miles traveled statewide, and increasing the percentage of non-drive-alone modes. Incentivizing and creating more TOD would help to accomplish each of these goals by increasing the amount of people who live near transit and improving the walkability of these areas. And so it has become a focus for state agencies. I encourage anyone who is interested to please take a look at our implementation guide and related dashboard, case examples, and resources. We'll place links to these in the chat. And just a reminder to please submit your questions using the Q&A function and not through the chat as well. And we will do our best to get us to as many as possible. Now I'm going to turn things over to Megan Fairfield-Peak, who's going to discuss the Transit Station Area Profile Tool. Megan?
Great, thanks, Brooks. Let me just share my screen. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Brooks, for giving that background on TOD. I'm Megan Fairfield Peak. I'm with Maryland Department of Planning, and today I'm going to be presenting on TSAP, your geospatial planning resource tool to transit-oriented development. I'm going to move through some background of the creation of the transit station area profile tool, and then I'm going to move over to the tool itself and give a demo and talk about its overall capabilities, just so people are aware now. I might say TSAP, I might say the tool, I might say the application. I am intending to mean the exact same thing every time, just wanted to give that precursor. Let's go ahead and dive in. So right off the bat, the Transit Stationary Profile tool is designed to encourage TOD by providing information about rail stations and the surrounding areas. Agencies, developers, local communities, and other TOD stakeholders can use this information as they apply for state TOD designations or plan development around and near transit stations. TSAP allows users to quickly determine locations of some of the priority areas that were identified in the 2024 Maryland Transit and Housing Opportunity Act. Those locations include state designated TODs, they include state owned land that is contiguous to a rail station, and then areas located within select buffers of specific land use and generalized zoning. The application breaks down into three main portions. The first being land summaries, and those are land summaries for the Maryland Department of Planning 2025 generalized zoning and the Maryland Department of Planning 2018 land use, and those are at 3 buffer distances. The next portion contains information on ridership, which is ridership for all of the rail systems from 2011 to 2024. And then finally is market demand, which is where you get those station area profiles. That's through Esri's business analyst widget, which allows users to look at various categories and statistics around the stations. So TSAP is GIS powered analysis. It allows users to overlay multiple geospatial layers to get a full picture of the areas surrounding a rail station. It allows you to overlay federal and state incentive zones. It also allows you to add your own stakeholder data, so it can be modified to really fit your own needs. And it's this flexibility that allows the tool to really inform TOD. So I know I might have moved through that pretty quickly, but I'm going to move over to the tool now and really dive deeper into its capabilities. So first, a bit of housekeeping with the TSAP application is this is designed for desktop use currently, and we have some screen zoom recommendations here in this opening splash screen. Mobile optimization is planned in the future, and there's a change log here in this opening screen, so keep an eye on that if you're looking for updates. The next piece I want to say is this application is extremely data heavy, and because of that, you may experience some lags. Make sure you allow the page to fully load before interacting with it. Now with the housekeeping out of the way, let's dive into the actual pieces. So I'm going to start over here on this left-hand side, and we have a series of tabs. The About section is going to give you an in-depth background on the creation of the tool, the methodology used for land use, generalized zoning, the ridership, and background on the station area profiles. This also includes a series of links that are going to give you increased detail on all of those pieces. Moving right over, we move to MDOT TOD. This is going to talk about the TOD designation process, joint processing, and touches a bit on the tool and how it's associated to this processing. Our next tab is our housing tab. The housing tab goes over that 2024 Act that I mentioned in the slides, and then it also discusses the 2025 executive order with a link that goes into further detail about that executive order. Next is a testimonial from the city of Aberdeen who discusses their use of the TSAP application in their TOD implementation. It's a nice background information of a true application of it. And if you end up using the tool and are interested in being included in the testimonials, please feel free to reach out via email that I'll share at the end of the PowerPoint. Finally, there's a help tab. This provides some frequently asked questions as well as the directions on how to build a station area profile. And then there's the contact information to reach out directly to the MDP GIS team. Now that we have this sidebar taken care of, I'm going to minimize it and we'll focus more on the tools now. So first, I just want to point out a few tools that are consistent among all of the tabs among the top of the application. The first being a filter tool. You can filter based on a select station, multiple stations, a state TOD designated area, and by county boundary. You have this add data option where you can add data from ArcGIS's Living Atlas, or you can upload a direct link to a REST server, or you can upload a file like a GeoJSON or a shapefile to really customize your view. There's a print function, which gives you the ability to print your map view with that added data if you choose to add it. And then finally, there's a brief survey. If you find yourself using the application and wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to give us your thoughts, consider taking the survey for us. We really appreciate it, and we're always looking to enhance usability. And for those who aren't familiar, I'll just highlight a few tools. There's some basic zoom functions as well as a home extent function. Then on the right-hand side, you have your layer list and your legend. You have a base map selector and a measure tool. Now for the actual data. So the land use tab is focused on the 2018 land use that's created by the Maryland Department of Planning, and it's summarizing the land at a quarter mile, half mile, and 3/4 mile buffers around each of the rail stations. You'll notice here at the bottom, it's listing the rail stations individually. But if you zoom into a given area, like if we go ahead and zoom in around the Baltimore area, you're going to notice that it filters the charts automatically. And with that, if you are looking to then see all of the stations again, you can hit your home default and it will take you back to that initial view. But here now we have a selected view of just those stations on the map. And you can hover over the individual sections and it will give you a quick little pop-up that it'll tell you the acreage of the land use and the percent of that within the quarter mile buffer here, or you could switch over to the half mile buffer. Gotta love technology sometimes when it won't load for us. Let's do a quick refresh just so we can see all of the capabilities. Like I said before, it's a data-driven piece, so it can bog down sometimes, although not super often, it does happen. In this layer list, there's traditionally significant options based around Maryland Department of Planning's, MDOT's, and overall state agencies' data sets that allow you that layering option. Let's go ahead and move over to the generalized zoning data. This is the 2025 generalized zoning, which came from the most recent update that was just released, which is focused on the county level zoning. There will be a municipality update in probably the next year, so feel free to look forward to that. So now that we are starting to feel comfortable, that's the same sidebar as the first section. But let's look at some of these other options like the filter option. So I'm going to go in here and let's go ahead and filter it down. Let's say to like Wheaton. I'm going to type it in and I'm going to select my station here. And then you need to turn on your filter. And you do that with this brief toggle switch. And it's going to zoom you in right to the station itself. And just as it did before, when you zoomed in with your scroll wheel or with the plus and minus button, it will populate your table. I'm going to zoom out a few clicks. And here we're getting the same information, but focused on generalized zoning instead of land use, where it's breaking down the acreage of each category and the percentage of those categories. There's also an attribute table if you prefer the information in a tabular form. So here would be a great option to move over to that print function where you can see your print area here, and you can change it accordingly based on customizing your view with minimizing the tables or changing your base map to something that's more appropriate for your use. Now let's slide over to our ridership. Ridership is sourced by MDOT's MTA and WMATA, which is an aggregation of the station and system's average weekday ridership. And this is intended to gauge transit demand for a given station. This time, let's use this filter tool again, but let's do multiple stations. So I'll go ahead and do Landover, Keenwood, and let's do Capitol Heights. Same thing as before. Once you have them selected, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the filter. As before, it zooms into the area that I filtered down to with the Landover, Deanwood, and Capitol Heights. But you notice the table is no longer displaying our information. And that's because these tables are broken down based on the transit system, not based in that buffer range. So these are all WMATA stations. So I'm going to go over to that WMATA Metro, and it gives you that breakdown of years. As I mentioned, it's 2011 to 2024 currently. And there's a key down here if you're interested in really focusing on specifically the 2027 or the 2017. And you can turn them off accordingly if you're only focused on one piece. And if you wanted to stop selecting these pieces, you can turn it off and it's going to zoom you back to that full extent and reload these pieces to be able to see it based on the Bethesda station or Forest Glen or whichever station you're interested in. Now let's get to the final piece of the transit station area profile tool, which are the station area profiles themselves. First, I want to point out that the station area profiles are through a third-party provider, Esri or ArcGIS Online. They have a business analyst widget, which is the base of these profiles. So if you are looking for additional capabilities, please feel free to reach out, but we do have some limitations with that. This pop-up here is going to show you the steps to create one of the profiles, but the instructions are also in that help menu on the sidebar, which I showed earlier, so you don't need to write these down or anything. So I'm going to agree to the above terms and press OK. I'm also going to minimize this here. The first step is to select a station. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zoom in, and we looked at that Wheaton station earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and select that again. I'm just selecting that by a single click on the point itself. Now you can go into your station area profile window and choose your buffer distances. So your buffer type options initially are rings, and that's just perfect circles surrounding the station. And you can set it to miles or kilometers, and you can change your increments. The next option is drive time, where you can do time or distance. And once again, you can change them individually. You can also set to have traffic involved. And then finally, there's walk time, which once again has a time and a distance option. It defaults to 5, 10, 15, but you can change it. We could even change it for this. Let's do 10, 15, 20. Although in this heat, I don't think any of us want to walk 20 minutes, but we'll go ahead and click next. So it's going to zoom into that selected station. For us, it's Wheaton, and it's going to show us those walkability or those walk time intervals, with this first one being that 10 minutes, 15, and 20 minutes. So this is estimating the walkability of an area. It doesn't necessarily consider sidewalks and things like that, but this is the current capabilities of this, and hopefully we'll continue to see growth in the buffer tool. Now you can select your infographics. So there's a significant amount of options, and you can even hover over this little icon among the side to kind of get an idea of what it might look like. It ranges anywhere from population analysis from Census and American Community Survey data to looking at businesses around the area, including restaurants and shopping capabilities. I think for now, let's go ahead and look at the employment overview, and I'm going to click Run Infographic. So the infographic will come up and it's going to default to what your smallest buffer ring is. So for us, it's that 10-minute walk. And it populates this, like I said, with Census and American Community Survey data and gives you this nice infographic. You can then click on each piece individually and explore more. So this is a 2025 households by income. This is the Esri source. So it does aggregate it, or excuse me, it does summarize it into an Esri demographics database. And this is showing you that estimated household by income for the area. But then you have it also looking at it versus the county level, but you can change it to state as well as the entire US. And that's an option for most infographics, but not all. So now that we're done looking at the 10-minute walk, we could switch to our 15-minute walk or 20-minute walk. And you see that it changes the infographic live to each of those pieces. And then finally, you do have the option to do a side-by-side comparison. It changes the layout of your infographic to put them next to each other, identifies that this is the Wheaton station, and you can scroll down and see this breakdown of commuters and employment for this area. Once you're ready to go back to your map, there's an X right here at the top, and you can hit back to change your buffers or change your station itself and be able to run this again as many times as you needed. That does bring me to the end of my demo, and I hope you get the chance to try out this application for yourself, as it can be a great jumping off point when looking at TOD considerations. I will be, or the Maryland Department of Planning will be sharing a couple links in the chat for both the tool and for our overall hub. And please feel free to email any questions or comments. Even if you're just feeling mappy, we're happy to discuss any piece of this. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Megan. It's great. Now I'm going to turn it over to Darren Cooper from the Maryland Department of Transportation.
Brooks. Get my slide deck up on the screen here. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here. My name is Darren Cooper. I'm a project manager with MDOT, working specifically at the Secretary's office within the Office of Real Estate and Economic Development. So, to take things forward, an additional step and provide some an additional perspective on setting the stage for a TOD, I'm going to walk through our approaches from a policy and strategy standpoint on how we've been moving forward with unlocking site potential at a number of TOD designated sites and just how we look at things big picture wise. So let's get going. Okay. So first and foremost, want to give some background, some context here. So Maryland's facing a significant housing challenge with an estimated shortage of approximately 120,000 housing units today, based on the Comptroller's 2025 report on housing and the economy. The state's also experienced significant domestic outmigration, particularly among younger and middle-income households, driven in part by housing affordability and cost of living pressures, which I know a number of us are aware of. Transportation in and of itself remains the second largest household expense after housing after accounting for housing costs in general. And TOD, we view TOD as one of the most effective ways to address these challenges by focusing growth where transit already exists and where public infrastructure investments have already been made. By locating housing near transit, we can fundamentally reduce transportation costs, increase housing choice, and create more connected communities. I will note that you see on the screen there are a couple of different percentages that decided to share based on some surveys that were done by the National Association of Realtors as well as the American Public Transportation Association. This kind of highlights some of the not only the value of transit, but how Gen Zers and millennials view and choose housing and a host of other things as it relates to transit. So let's talk a bit about the opportunity in itself for the state of Maryland. So the opportunity in and of itself is significant. MDOT alone owns more than 300 acres of undeveloped state-owned land adjacent to rail transit stations throughout the state. These sites represent the potential for more than 17,000 housing units and billions of dollars in long-term economic activity. I'll walk through the table at the bottom of the screen here, but that aggregate of 17,000 comes from a host of different evaluations and studies that we've conducted over the years to really understand the opportunity that we have at hand. MDOT has invested nearly $3 billion in MTA and WMATA service in FY25 alone. And ultimately, the state is looking to leverage development to maximize return on existing transit investments through increased ridership, through economic activity, and long-term tax revenue generation. Along those lines, you can see a breakout here of the housing units between the MARC Penn Line, the commuter rail line, Baltimore Metro and Light Rail, and the WMATA Metrorail Stations. You can see across those three, there's an aggregate of the 17,000 housing units. And then below that, you can see that how we break down the potential state and local tax revenue implications here. Effectively, just across these three, we're north of $4 billion worth of economic impact from a state and local tax revenue standpoint, especially for a number of sites that are not currently generating revenues for the state. So let's talk about advancing the state goals in and of themselves through TOD. Governor Moore has identified TOD as a key strategy to addressing Maryland's housing shortage and strengthening the economic competitiveness of the state. With that, excuse me, the governor's housing legislation that will go into effect on October 1st of this year will actually help provide additional tools to advance TOD statewide. The two pieces of legislation in particular I want to point out and that are noted here at the bottom of the screen are the Maryland Transit and Housing Opportunity Act. A couple things in relation to that that I want to highlight is that it allows mixed-use development by right around high-frequency transit stations. It eliminates parking minimums near transit, provides the state authority over zoning and land use for development on state-owned land near transit stations, and automatically extends enterprise zone tax benefits to TOD designated sites. In addition to that, there's the Maryland Housing Certainty Act. That act, there are two things I want to highlight for that in relation to that real quick, is that once a project receives approval, developers ultimately gain vested rights to proceed with the approved use and development for at least 5 years. And it delays the collection of certain impact fees and taxes until after construction is completed, ultimately reducing upfront development costs during the most financially challenging stage or phase of a project. So with that, I'm going to drill in a little bit further. So big picture, what you see on the screen are a number of key priorities for the state. And I just want to highlight these very quickly to help set the table for our strategy as it relates to TOD and how we're approaching it and things that we put into place from a policy standpoint. So transit-oriented development is one of the state's primary strategies for leveraging state-owned land and transit investments to advance Maryland's housing, transportation, and economic development goals. With that, MDOT's, in particular, our TOD program is focused on 4 core objectives, and the 4 core objectives encapsulate all the elements that you see currently on the screen. Our 4 core objectives are increasing housing supply, including affordable and workforce housing, increasing transit ridership, maximizing return on public transit investments, and supporting long-term economic growth through increased local and state tax generation, similar to what I was pointing out on the prior slide as it relates to the overarching opportunity across the 300 plus acres that the MDOT, that the state currently owns and controls. So let's talk for a quick second about how MDOT is moving forward with two different types of development. Here, I wanted to provide a little context about how we speak about development opportunities, TOD in particular, and the nuance of joint development. So a lot of times we talk about transit-oriented development, which is compact, walkable communities centered around transit stations that attract new residents, workers, and visitors. That is certainly near and dear to us and a key focal point for us in moving things forward. What I want to call out and point to in particular is joint development, because I know it's been touched upon already. Megan's presentation, it was mentioned in the TSAP tool, and we talk about a lot on the MDOT side. And what that is that joint development involves, from our vantage point, it involves the MDOT utilizing its own land as part of a transaction with the expectation and requirement that public transit facilities are incorporated into the development program. Some of the facility improvements can include things like commuter parking structures, bus layover facilities, even potentially in-corridor improvements at times. So it's a host of different things, but it is the key differentiator here is leveraging our land for TOD, but also making sure that it incorporates some key improvements for connectivity and utilization of the transit facilities themselves. The core objectives that I mentioned on the prior slide are definitely encapsulated within our joint development policy that was released in early 2024. This policy in and of itself is applicable to all of our existing and future joint development projects on state-owned property that's adjacent to a planned or existing transit station property, or any part of which is located within 1/2 mile of a planned or existing transit station, and property that is adjacent to a planned or existing transit corridor. So I want to make sure to highlight the fact that we've got that policy that did go live in early 2024. So got a number of different things represented here on the screen. So in order for us to realize TOD opportunities in going from planning to implementation, it requires an incredible set of tools to really unlock development and tee up success, if you will. One of the biggest challenges facing TOD today in Maryland is financial feasibility. While the demand for housing remains strong, projects face a number of distinct and significant barriers, from elevated construction costs, higher financing costs, expensive infrastructure requirements, parking and transit replacement requirements, local zoning and entitlement constraints, impact fees and development costs. All of those things we're constantly taking into consideration and trying to figure out how we address those appropriately. So in doing so, our focus is on not only identifying the barriers as early as possible, but assembling tools needed to bridge the financing gaps to de-risk projects before actually taking them to market. We're currently addressing these challenges through a combination of policy, planning, financing, and project delivery tools that includes strategic portfolio-wide TOD planning studies, one of which, for example, is we did the MARC Penn Line TOD strategy that were released in October 2024, and some others since then. Excuse me. We perform early due diligence and feasibility analyses to daylight some critical path items and barriers, again, that we can address before taking things to market. Right sizing the transit infrastructure requirements for each and every site, leveraging land value. That is something that we do in a variety of different ways, and especially as it relates to activities that we're taking forward currently, trying to get some different improvements delivered on sites, and one of which I'll share later on in this presentation. Working with our local jurisdictional partners to implement different tools like tax increment financing, TIFs, pilot agreements, and tax abatements, maximizing opportunities in enterprise zones and opportunity zones, working with state and local agencies on identifying public sector anchoring opportunities at TOD sites, For example, one of the things that we're looking at is a site that we took to market, the Bowie State MARC station is adjacent to Bowie State University in itself, so leveraging that institution to create a great opportunity to advance TOD there. Utilizing MDOT's TOD capital grant and revolving loan program and MEDCO's infrastructure financing tools to support project delivery is another approach that we're also other additional approaches that we're also utilizing. The capital grant and revolving loan program is fairly new, or got launched in 2025. So we're looking at some increasing successes there. And then ultimately, kind of close out this slide, is we're combining these things with the governor's policy reforms, and these tools effectively help bridge the feasibility gaps, reducing project risk and moving TOD projects from planning to implementation and delivery, which is a key focal point for us time and time again, is getting to that implementation and delivery component. So in focusing on moving toward implementation of TOD, as you can imagine, both partnership and pairing of tools, programs, and incentives are paramount and invaluable. So what this slide depicts and captures is that while it's not inclusive of all the local jurisdictions that we have and continue to be engaged with, it does lightly touch upon some of our most recent activity and the results we've collectively achieved thus far. Our realization is that local jurisdictions truly hold the most powerful land use and financial tools to support development. And so we've had incredible conversations, engagements with Anne Arundel County, Baltimore City, for example. And what we've done is we've paired that with, at the state level, partnerships that we can advance through MDOT, Department of Housing and Community Development, Department of Commerce, to fundamentally enhance project feasibility through wraparound policies and incentives. DHCD in terms of their tax credit programs, Commerce again with things like enterprise zone tax credits, a number of different things that we can do to combine these programs and make a very attractive opportunity, and ultimately garner the attention of the private sector. The private sector typically responds to public investments, policies, and incentives by contributing their private capital and constructing new development. We've also seen that the culmination of the partnerships at different sites and how that has really generated some robust intrigue and inquiries about sites and opportunities that we've taken to the market thus far. And we're looking to take these key learnings and continue building upon them going forward. So with that being said, we certainly see the private sector as not being a passenger in this strategy, but truly being the engine. Anchor institutions, developers, and financial institutions all play a pivotal role in not only helping us set the stage for TOD, but also generating interest in presenting realities that heavily aid in the attainability of the projects and their respective goals. So with the anchor institutions leveraging real estate footprints to grow jobs near transit and catalyzing mixed-use walkable developments near stations, partnerships with developers early on with the local jurisdictions on things like station area plans, align entitlements, and with market opportunities and market realities. And then ultimately, and certainly last and certainly not least, but from a banking and financial institutional perspective, deploying capital into TOD projects and really including a strong focus on the community reinvestment obligations in transit corridors and support of community development financial institutions that are also active in transit corridors. So really leveraging a host of different parties that can really collectively advance the incredible opportunities that we've got. So if I were to distill all this down in terms of the opportunity for TOD and the actions required to advance it, it really falls into two distinct buckets. Or a two-pronged approach, if you will. Strategies that can be executed upon by the local jurisdiction, and those for MDOT to advance that are all essential to creating a path forward that'll move us in the right direction. From a local jurisdictional standpoint, it's taking a look at and updating land use and planning to support TOD and making sure that there are tools that can be implemented to address financial feasibility barriers wherever possible. And then from the MDOT perspective, continuing forging strategic partnerships across the board and increasing development readiness of our state-owned sites. So really digging in, performing our due diligence to make sure that the sites really are enabled for and able to move forward, and we've removed as many barriers as reasonably possible beforehand. So I want to dive in very quickly on a project in particular as an example. So here we have the Odenton MARC Station as a joint development opportunity. It's in Anne Arundel County. This is a site that is a very heavily utilized MARC station along the Penn Line. It is a joint development opportunity that demonstrates how these policy objectives translate into implementation. So the project leverages state-owned land to the tune of nearly 13 acres to increase housing while strengthening the MARC station and surrounding community. This project in and of itself, and as you can see on the screen, is something that we officially announced in late 2025, that we selected Homes for America and Questar Properties as a development team, our joint development partner, to advance design and development plan and negotiations of a binding agreement to fundamentally deliver a project that will include over 500 new housing units. More than 130 of those units will be affordable units, more than 30,000 square feet of ground floor retail space, and a significant public open space element, as well as community amenities, also tying into the rail station in itself and improving bike ped orientation of the station and access across the board. So I will take a bird's eye view to kind of further demonstrate how we've included our partners and how we got to where we are. So Odenton demonstrates how state, local, and private sector partners can align multiple funding and financing tools across a single project, with each project component utilizing different delivery and financing strategy ultimately to achieve delivery. So to the south or to the left of the screen is a new 1,100 space parking garage. Our partners in Anne Arundel County are taking on that garage. It's a $56 million project that'll be funded through a TIF with contributions from MDOT's TOD and capital grant program. From a station and connectivity improvement vantage point, MDOT's leveraging the value of its land in and of itself to support station access, connectivity, and transit infrastructure improvements while reducing the overall project cost. That is a contribution that we're making towards the project. The developer, on our behalf, we're looking at delivering a number of these key elements. From an affordable housing standpoint, again, more than 130 affordable housing units going and supporting through a combination of 4% and 9% LIHTC, obviously leveraging Maryland DHCD funding programs. We have a market rate component and retail as well. That rental housing and retail is privately financed and generates new housing supply, generates economic activity, tax revenue, again, helps drive transit ridership. And then from a partnership standpoint, partnership approach, this project, this stage of the project, phase one, is a partnership between MDOT, Anne Arundel County, DHCD, the private sector, everybody playing a role in bringing together the funding, financing, public investments needed to make the project feasible. The key takeaway here is that successful TOD projects require multiple funding and financing tools working together to bridge feasibility gaps and ultimately deliver on things like housing, transit improvements, and community benefits. So with that, I will close, just have a slide here with some key content information from myself, Derek Davies, who's the Director of Development here in our unit, as well as our Chief, David Zaidain. I appreciate the time, and I am going to pass things back to you, Brooks.
All right. Thank you very much, Darren. That was great. And next up, we have Cecily Bedwell from Design Collective.
Great. Thank you, Brooks and Darren and Megan. This information has been very helpful. Today, I'll build on the state's policies and tools and talk a little bit about how you bring TODs into the built environment, how you make them a reality using those tools, but also working with the public sector and private sector. In my role at Design Collective, I'm often working with those local jurisdictions, counties, cities, and towns, and then with the private development. As Darren said, it takes all hands at the table to make these projects a reality. So Design Collective, we're located in Baltimore. We have an office in Chicago. We are a multidisciplinary design firm, so we do take that approach and bring the various lens of architecture, interiors, planning, urban design, landscape architecture, and signage graphics and wayfinding into projects. This helps us view the projects in a broader sense. And just to step back a moment, wanted to cover, everyone has been talking about TOD, but I just wanted to mention a couple of the key features and add to the benefits that we've been talking about. So some of the key features of a TOD, it's a mixed use development, it's walkable, it's sustainable. So you can see those metrics in the tools that Megan talked about in terms of walkability. The benefits of TOD is to improve the access. That's access for the community to jobs, services, and amenities, and also for business owners to have their employees be able to access their businesses, as well as visitors, shoppers, and for institutions, for their employees, staff, students, healthcare workers, et cetera. So it is a benefit to all that we improve access. Economic development, as we have been talking about, TODs have the ability to unlock some of the underutilized parcels near station areas, or when a new line is coming in, to tap into the potential of new development near those station areas. Community health, this, by walking or biking the last mile to the transit station, and just having more activity, as well as connections to healthcare services, improves communities' health. And then increase ridership. So TOD, one of the main goals of MDOT, MTA, when they're looking at station areas, is it's a win-win to promote ridership by placing more people, more density near the station. So the more TOD that can be located near it, that boosts the ridership. So it helps out. So it's really, can be transformative for areas. It can help solve some of the housing issues. It can also serve people who don't either elect not to drive, cannot drive because they're too old, too young, or don't have the resources to do so. Speaking of resources, I do have a number of links listed here on the page where you can find more information. Just to note, we did help MDOT recently come up with a strategy document that's within these links and can show more information documented about each station area, looking at what land is available as well. So you have that in the tool that Megan talked about. There's also the summary document listed here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some design principles. These are principles that really apply to TOD locations, all TOD locations, regardless of the scale, whether it's in an urban center or in a suburban infill location. With these principles applied, it increases transit ridership, makes transit ridership an easy choice. Increases micro-mobility as well to access those, and can make for successful TOD projects. So I'll go through these 8 one by one. First, transit first, seamless access, giving people the information to make it readily easy to get on transit, to connect various modes of transit. Make sure that paying a fare, if the transit is not free, is an easy thing, that there are short walks or short bike routes and safe bike routes, and pedestrian crossings. So all of these things combined, again, can make the choice to use transit more viable. Mixed use and inclusive. So we want to make sure diversity really is what makes a lot of TOD projects the best. So having a variety of uses such as residential, office, retail, community services, institutional, open spaces with activated ground floor makes those spaces not just TOD development to solve a housing crisis, but places that people want to be. And that's really what we're aiming for here.
Hey, Cecily, 1 second. I'm sorry. Could you just hit the presenter so it's full screen?
Yes, thank you for that. Meant to do that. Appreciate that. So we want to also make sure that we aren't displacing people. That has been some of the planning that we have done in the past. We want to stay away from that and remember that, you know, in all neighborhoods where new transit's going or new bus route, et cetera, there may be some impact to communities. So how can we protect them from that and actually have local businesses and community members benefit from the investment in transit? So this is not just for the existing residents, but also local businesses, which might be the backbone of those communities. We all, you know, in Maryland, there's a very strong complete streets movement. Actually executing on those is a little bit more difficult when you have a lot of forces pulling this way and that way. But really the idea of complete streets, making sure that streets are designed for pedestrians, bicyclists, transit vehicles, and automobiles together, so it's safe and accessible for all. That means that we want to make sure that there are adequately protected bike lanes, the sidewalks are clear, safely lit, shaded preferably, and buffered from moving traffic. We want to make sure that we minimize curb cuts so that, you know, crossings are easier for pedestrians and cyclists. And I mentioned the lighting, seating also at intervals helps to make it more accessible for folks who have mobility concerns. Next principle is context-sensitive density and design. We have talked about increasing density, but we want to do that at a scale that doesn't overwhelm the surrounding neighborhood. So context-sensitive means taking that into account, transitioning scale, reflecting some of the fabric, and then stepping up the density as you get closer to those transit stations. Where there are historic structures or open spaces, we want to make sure to maintain those so that the stations have their own identity, so that the community identity is maintained. We build on that rather than overrunning that. And that can be done in a way to adaptively reuse those buildings, again, a more sustainable approach where viable. Green infrastructure and climate resilience. This is looking at how do we, transit, having accessible transit certainly helps from a sustainability issues, but what else can we build in? Can we build in shaded sidewalks to reduce the heat island effect? Can we implement green roofs? Can there be EV charging stations incorporated? So if people are choosing to drive or use scooters, et cetera, they have a way to recharge and use less fossil fuels. And lastly, connectivity and multimodal integration. Having a fine-grained network of streets improves access for all, as well as for emergency vehicles. It gives alternative routes. Having those public open spaces near stations or around activated ground floor uses make them more memorable. Sometimes those are active, sometimes those are passive spaces. Having micro mobility to make that last mile and easy, that could be a bike share like shown here, or bike racks at a station so that it's easy to, choose to ride your bike to the station. And then again, making sure that pedestrian and bike paths connect to and are easily negotiated. When we talk about infrastructure, there's a baseline, there's enhanced, and there's placemaking. So mobility infrastructure can be used as an anchor for investment. It also, again, makes that choice to use alternative transportation more viable, safer. So if we are just providing crosswalks, as shown to the left, it doesn't create the environment that is really encouraging. It may not feel safe to people. Some people may not be able to cross in the designated time. So that's really like baseline. We have to have crosswalks that signalize intersections, but how can we then take a look at how to enhance those to make them welcoming? So I'm in the middle section looking at a shared use path. It's an improvement, but it doesn't go quite all the way. It's not shaded. The bike facilities are split. So I imagine there's another bike path on the opposite side, I would hope. Pedestrians are there, but they're not moving along or connecting to areas that feel vibrant. Same thing in the bottom. I mean, may look to a lot of people like, great, a bike lane. It's even painted green. There's a buffer, but there's no protection for that bike lane. So unless that street is posted for under 25 miles per hour, that's not really a safe location for a cyclist to be. If we go to the right and start talking about how this micromobility infrastructure can really improve and spur TOD. Looking at the Indianapolis Cultural Trail here really spurred development. So there's a lot of research on this, talking about how that one infrastructure, micromobility infrastructure project helped to sponsor TOD development, again, returning money to the taxpayers, building community, enhancing businesses along that. So how do we get there? Some of the work that we do is taking a look at how the planning can set the stage for TOD. So it starts in early days. Sometimes it's a long horizon from the time when we start a project at the master planning level and when things are actually built. So as you can see, this is College Park, Riverdale Park. We did a transit district development plan. We started in 2013, finished in 2014. It was a 9-month planning process, and we looked at the 300 acres that some may know. It used to be called M Square. Now it's the Discovery District in College Park, with many holdings by the University of Maryland. There's also the Maryland Metro Green Line, MARC station, and there will be the 2 Purple Line stops within this area. So this was pre-planning, again, to really set the stage for TOD. And what happened through this is that the master plan, sector plan, and rezoning, as we mentioned, as Darren mentioned, that's a critical component to have the zoning match what you want to envision the place to be in the future, to eliminate those barriers to development. We also looked at walk sheds from the new stations as well as the existing stations, a mixed-use approach and network of streets, connections to the trail system along the Anacostia. So all of those things played into the planning of this. And as we look at plans like this, again, it takes a long horizon. So we were looking at it in phases of what's existing. You can see fairly, spread out buildings here in a very research park type environment, and then infilling with some projects. So we had 2025 down here, and, some of this has happened along here. And then we'll look at this area off to the left. So then by 2040, you might see something like this, and it might change over time. But the key pieces are that the policies and the zoning are in place to allow what's envisioned to happen, near transit and connected. So this is a project that looks at that location near the College Park Airport, Aviation Village, which is now going forward through development. It was issued as a county RFP, and then a consortium of developers and various property owners are moving this forward. So we took a look at what the space could be and how to build that identity. Again, a mix of uses, as shown up here in the upper left, an aerial of what this could look like if people know the area. The airport runways are here. The aviation museum is in the top middle, and properties owned by the University of Maryland as well as the county. And then what this place could look like with proper, pedestrian crossings, activated ground floor uses. So really filling in an area that is low density, industrial, but really close to a lot of transit assets and capitalizing on those. I want to look at also now the Blue Line corridor. This is the Central Avenue Blue and Silver Line sector plan that we had done. Again, our work was completed in 2022, but by no means is the work done. So this was looking at the 4 station areas to really see, take areas that were more suburban in character and look at with the investment of transit, how that could grow into an area of mixed use, taller buildings, still appropriate, and make sure that the identity of each of these stations is reflected in the planning. So one of the things that, in this case, Prince George's County did, we was looking at the assets that existed. So there was the the county government seat that was growing and intensifying. There was a new hospital that was coming in, the University of Maryland Capital Regional Hospital. There was, of course, the metro station, which now has the two lines, blue and silver. But there were also some things such as, an underutilized surface park and a failing shopping center, big box center that was very close to transit, walkable to transit, but was being vacated. So we look at that as a land bank. So how can we take a look at that? So we worked with the county, we worked with developers in some cases to look at building this out. And I'll just share a few images. The county really did set into place, and this is something that local jurisdictions can do, is look at the access routes to the transit. And here they looked at doing some complete street projects, doing the Central Avenue Connector Trail, looking at placemaking and wayfinding. So all of those projects were implemented to help spur the development they wanted to see and the access to transit. They also took a look at intersection improvements for pedestrian crossings, and on-road bicycle connection to the trail system, as well as a civic plaza project. So in the short term, starting to look at a network of complete streets with intersection improvements, the station improvements and access to the station, starting to integrate some open spaces and new gateway. And then in the long term, taking a look at what that development could be, adjusting building heights to densify near the transit station, and then step down as you move towards the community surrounding that. Make sure that the access is the best it can be. With the hospital at the center here, that's a driver for medical office as well as residential and commercial uses at the core of this new area. And then again, looking at how this could be identified, each of the stations having their own, celebrating their own identity and being different draws. Looking then at some design guidelines. So we talked about some principles that should align with all TOD projects. These are some things that designers or reviewers should keep in mind when they're implementing projects. So one of the things that we'd like to see is that buildings hold the corner, that the spaces, especially at key intersections, have active ground floor uses, that the entrances face the street to foster that connectivity and engagement of pedestrians as they move along this. Not all buildings can have retail at the ground floor. This is at key nodes. The commercial uses are close to the street. Residential uses, whether that's vertically or horizontally, might step back or be protected more to transition uses within the area. Transparency is important. We don't want a lot of blank walls. That doesn't make for a very active, engaging walk. So having more visibility on the ground floor is important. And this is really, again, on primary streets, secondary streets, or service streets, as we might call them, might have more blank walls, but really looking at the projects to make sure that the uses are activated. Breaking up the scale of long buildings. We want density, but we don't want them to overwhelm the streetscape or feel relentless. So varying that by building heights, facade articulation, materials, planes and color changes can all help to mitigate some denser long buildings. And then we know that there are places in transition. There may be some parking garage structures that are on primary streets. There may be some surface parking lots. Screening those, hopefully temporarily, can help again make a more engaging walk. I want to now just take a look at putting these principles into practice and show two of the projects that, were near transit and were built and constructed. So taking the design into fruition and really showing what TOD projects can look like. So this is Arrowwood in North Bethesda, Maryland. It was completed in 2020. As you can see in the key map, it is close to the North Bethesda Metro Station, just a couple-minute walk. It's a 7-story LEED Gold targeted building, and in its prior life was just a large surface parking lot. So not a great land bank asset to have near station, but not a great driver of transit ridership or helping anything other than parking cars. So it's a building that has 294 multifamily units, including 37 moderately priced dwelling units. You can see it has an engaging streetscape with access and vitality. Does not have retail in this location. Again, not all buildings can have retail at the base, but in its place, the lobby and amenities are visible to the street, making it a nice building to walk by. And you can see that it's modulated. As we talked about, the long facade is broken up. The facade steps back. There is a bike share nearby, again, encouraging easy access. There's a good relationship indoor-outdoor to the interior courtyards, making that living in an apartment near transit, a nice experience and a chosen experience rather than something that might not compare to other projects elsewhere. Now looking at one high-rise project that we did, this was completed in 2018. It really was spurred by the coming new Purple Line Light Rail Station in Bethesda Chevy Chase. So this project, developers saw the potential. It was a joint project with Montgomery County Housing Opportunity Commission. It does have mixed income units, including workforce units. And it's an 11-story LEED silver building that has a portal to make an easy connection to the Purple Line station, which you can see it's just about a block and a half away. So that's another project that anticipated or was spurred on by the coming of transit. So transit stations really can build land value in these areas and spur development and help increase and provide units, both affordable and market rate units. You can see a few more images here. So again, a dense project, but a portal that connects through, a roof terrace that is accessible to all of the units to capture some of the views downtown. And that is it. So I will stop sharing and thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Cecily. So now I think we have a little bit of time for some Q&A with our panelists. Let me see. Hang on 1 second. Please bear with me. And Mary, do you know the best way to take some live questions here?
Are you looking for the live questions?
Do you know, should we just go from the Q&A or should we go?
Yes. No, go from the Q&A. Yep.
Okay. And I think this would be a good question for Darren. Scott S is asking, how did MDOT come to own 300 acres near transit facilities?
It's a great question. I appreciate that, Scott. So it's a combination of between right of way and just acreage that we've had for that 300 acres encapsulates a combination of right of way, service parking lots, park and ride facilities. As I mentioned in my slide deck, When you start taking a look at all of the systems that we're pointing to, the rail systems, the metro systems in Baltimore and beyond, the commuter rail systems, it doesn't take long to get there. To kind of give an example, the Odenton MARC station in and of itself, the site that I pointed to is 13 acres. That is not the full Odenton MARC station site. There is another surface parking lot to the north that is another, it's another 8 acres if I remember correctly. And then our county partners actually own a 4+ acre site to the east of our station that's also surface parking. So part of this is like not only evaluating how we got the land, but what are we fundamentally doing with the assets? And surface parking is obviously not the best use.
Great. Thank you, Darren. And I think we're going to have a few more for you. I'm trying not to put them all in a row because you are our MDOT representative today. But okay, so our next. This is from Justin F. Does the open space allocation for TOD include natural land as well as landscaped?
Great question. Yes, it encapsulates both. So there are some existing elements on the site that does encapsulate an existing stormwater facility and some there's a conservation space, very small, but it is captured there, and the joint development partner would be responsible for adding to that. So I would say about 50% of what you all saw in the visual illustration is the developer adding to what's in place now.
Great, thank you. I think we have one for Cecily here from Abigail. Is there a reason for modular or mass breaking style architecture in TOD style developments?
It's really to be sensitive to the context and we as humans relate to how engaging a streetscape is. We might not all understand the components of that, but there is research based on, we do perceive the first 22 feet of a building, so that active ground floor is certainly needed to engage us, and that really makes the walking or a chosen path when something is boring, unarticulated, and feels unwelcoming. We're reluctant to move along there. We may also feel unsafe. A lit storefront or a lit sidewalk does make it more accessible, especially to people in the evening moving to and from a late night job, for example. So the massing in terms of is really related to not overwhelming. Again, if we're walking through a canyon, that doesn't feel like a nice space to walk through, that blocks all sunlight. It's not as engaging as a space to move through. It may also feel overwhelming to surrounding smaller scale development. So all of those things are important. People may not think it's as important as parking ratios, but we really are people who relate to our environment. And so those signals about scale, lighting, safety, we take those in, and our choices about using mobility and transit are affected by those.
Thank you. And to kind of go off of that question a little bit, we have a question from Carolyn. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about the benefits and problems of many small footprint buildings versus larger footprint buildings in a TOD plan.
So sorry, what are the benefits, or how to
benefit, like a costs and
okay.
Benefits and versus the problems of many small footprint buildings versus kind of looking at it as larger mass buildings.
Right. So, talking about multifamily buildings, it does come down to the construction cost, but also the management. So it's looking at, both the building of that building as well as the long-term management. So most developers that we work with have a sweet spot of a multifamily building and want to see around, say around 200 to 300 units. And that is managed by a staff, and it's also a building that can be done in the typical, 5/1 or 4/1, and when I say 5/1, I'm talking about the ground floor being a podium of concrete that might have retail or other amenities with wood stick frame above it. So we're capped out at a 7-story building when we talk about it. So a developer wants to maximize the construction that they're getting, or the units that they're getting for the construction that they're putting in, the money that they're putting into it. Once we go above 7 floors, we're into high rise, and there's a whole different building code that has to be taken into consideration. Hence why you see a lot of multifamily wrap buildings in that, 5 to 7 story, because again, they're capitalizing on those. We do love to see the missing middle housing, of course, but it takes, it's a more difficult project to finance and to manage. So that's why maybe we're not seeing those as much, but we certainly want to leave the door open to projects like that can fill that middle gap of people looking or transitioning from the single family to the high-rise multifamily and mid-rise multifamily.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Celisa, and I'll take this one. This is a question asking, how does the Department of Planning engage with the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development to coordinate efforts? And the answer is we work closely with the Department of Housing and as well as MDOT and as well with Commerce and so on. I think Darren touched on this a little bit during his presentation, but we are all involved during TOD discussions and designation applications and so on. Just going through some of these questions. So we have a question from Patrick asking, parking demand at transit stations has changed a lot since 2020. How much has the planning for parking at TOD sites been adjusted over the past few years to account for changing travel behavior, since many of these projects have been in planning for more than a decade?
I can jump into that one, but I'm sure there might be some
Sure.
that Darren can add. I know that, parking does cost a lot of money. So when we're talking about surface parking, it's about, 8 to 10,000 for a surface park space. You're jumping up to 20 to 25,000 per space for a structured parking. And if you're going underground, you're probably looking at 30 to 40,000. All that being said is developers don't really want to pay for structured parking. That is a lot of cost on their development. Some do charge rent, but not all can, depending on the economics and market demand of the place. But they also want to meet the need. They also have to prove to their financial partners that it's a viable project and competitive in the market. So I think it's kind of finding that sweet spot. We advocate for lower parking ratios, and we also look at shared use as well as modal reductions when we can prove that. We often have to prove that. Sometimes the zoning regulations it's great, and sometimes we help write those to get reduced parking standards or requirements near transit. We also have been looking at, a number of developers that we're looking at, working with are already starting to look at how to build buildings that might transition over time. For example, if you have a structured parking garage versus an automated parking structure, it's easier to remove that shell of the automated parking structure. And then in the future, that space could be used for a fitness center or some other space that needs the volume, supermarket, etc. So some developers are starting to look at how buildings might adapt over time when the parking is not needed. Unfortunately, we still are in that transition period where there are some cars that are, people need to park, and usually those get left behind in a parking garage when people are going to their jobs elsewhere by transit.
Yeah,
Thank you, Cecily.
Just
Sorry, go ahead.
add to that real quick, though. Cecily, I appreciate you taking that question first, because you gave some really great data points and context there. Just to add to that, we are experiencing the same things. We take into account a number of different things all the time in terms of utilization of parking, where folks are coming from. Is there a need for the number of spaces we got at any particular space station, Odenton in particular? I know I responded to some folks in the chat, but there are 2,000 service parking spaces at that station. It's one of the most heavily utilized stations that we've got because it's within 2 miles of the state's largest employer, i.e. Fort Meade. So part of what we're doing is accommodating a number of distinct needs, but working with our local jurisdictional partners. Cecily pointed to things like shared use. So part of this parking garage, we're having conversations with the county about how part of it could be used to support like the affordable housing and parking requirements associated with that. Also working with the county as it relates to parking requirements, and whether or not those ratios, how they come into play with respect to TOD. So yes, we are absolutely paying attention to all those things and always having continual dialogue with our partners about what is the best and most effective approach, knowing what's going on today, where we see trends going for the future. Can't predict the future, but obviously coming out of COVID and taking a look at a host of different things, like the aggregate of all the data points and trying to make smart decisions.
Great, thanks, Darren. And I think we have another one for you here. Given the repeated emphasis placed on TOD not displacing existing communities and opening up access to all kinds of people, what kind of role does MDP or MDOT play in maximizing the number of affordable units provided in new developments?
That is a great question. So, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's a housing crisis in the state, and a large part of what we look at doing with our sites is how can we address that and not just, hey, there's more deployment of market rate units, but housing for all. And so we are heavily engaged with MDP and other state agencies, DHCD included, on what that may look like. And so we have, to kind of give an example, we have an MOU in place with DHCD. It also went into place in 2024. And what that does is it helps prioritize TOD, especially if there are developers that are looking to deliver affordable housing on our sites. And so taking that into consideration, like, hey, there are additional points that can be scored for delivering affordable housing on TOD sites to further incentivize and push for that delivery. But I think overall, it's an ongoing dialogue because it is a priority for each and every one of us, and just figuring out how we continue to keep that as a one of the true north targets, and coming up with really creative solutions to get there.
Great, thank you, Darren. We have a request for Cecily, I believe, to maybe provide some potential academic resources to support the urban design principles that you discussed. I think the chat would be a good place if you have some time to get to that.
I will if we run out of time.
Okay.
The person may contact me via the email that I listed. I'm not sure if I'd be able to pull it together in 7 minutes. So.
Sounds good. A question from Quinn: how can you design for projects in TOD areas that require parking now but won't need it in the future?
I mean, I think we touched on that a bit, but I think, we have looked at projects and we tend to take a long-term view of these planning projects. So we understand that you need to have flexibility, you need to have adaptability over time. So can parking garages, if those are required, be placed on the periphery? Or like I said, there are automated parking systems that are becoming more prevalent and a little bit more cost effective. They're not quite there to be competitive with a structured parking garage. But if you have a system like that, it's much easier to deconstruct within a shell than all the various layers or levels of a parking structure, leading to more adaptability over time. So if that technology becomes even more viable, meaning more affordable and feasible, that would allow for more flexibility over time. But there's also things that we can plan for, obviously, surface parking lot and other resources that could transition over time. Who knows? Maybe data centers will start going in more vacant parking garages. I mean, there are things that we can't predict now, but there are uses that probably will fit in well into those parking spaces that we have way too many of.
Thank you, Cecily. Okay. And we have a question from Robert. How does the number of parking spaces in a development relate to the number of dwelling units?
All right, good question, Robert. I was literally typing a response to that question.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. So the garage in and of itself is a public garage, and so a couple different things I want to point out here is that we got great partners in Anne Arundel County, and that the local zoning code was recently updated, and it points to a little more than a 1-to-1 ratio on dwelling. Was actually this is a really great question. Because when I mention drilling in the zoning that's conducive to TOD and all that stuff, a lot of times we talk about zoning to parking, or excuse me, dwelling units to parking, and it's a 1-to-1. But there are some jurisdictions that even have parking requirements that are based on beds, not on units. And so with that, we've been in conversation for quite some time with our partners in Anne Arundel County. They've had a downward adjustment on their parking requirements, getting closer to a more typical 1-to-1. But the beauty of the partnership is that they also have language that allows for the developer to provide a narrative and justification as to why they can go below the ratio and why it makes sense to not overload or overburden the site with parking. So as it stands right now, it is above just over 1-to-1 ratio in the depiction, but it could certainly go below that, and that's what we're hoping for.
Great. Thank you, Darren.
Absolutely.
And I see the chat is going off, but we encourage everyone, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. That's where we're reading from for these. Okay, we have a question from Miles. Is there any way to request increases in the number of trains or extended hours from MDOT for transit, like the MARC train, or after a municipality receives a TOD designation?
That is a great question. The driver is ultimately utilization. And so as demand increases, our partners at MTA analyze data all the time and are constantly looking for ways that they can increase frequencies and efficiencies of operations. So I think that is something that it's constantly evolving. There's no simple answer to that one other than capturing the data, leveraging the data, and making the appropriate adjustments from there.
And we have a question from Rohan. To what extent is MDOT investigating restarting old discontinued rail lines for trams, microtransit options to connect more residents into these new TODs?
So I do not have an immediate answer for you on that. I know that's something that is, you're not the first to raise that. So I think that's one of the elements that we're going to be continually digging into as it relates to just overall real estate assets and what can be done with them and better community connections across the board.
Great. Well, I think we are coming up on 2:00. So I just want to say thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to our panelists for a great presentation today. We hope that you'll be able to join us at our upcoming webinars, which we have not announced yet, but we are planning a few for September and October coming up. And please look out for this webinar online if you care to go back and watch any segment of it again. It should be up after we take care of the accessibility requirements in a few weeks. Yeah, thank you all again.